Hello, welcome to the Green Growth series. Green economy is defined as low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. And in this series, we want to showcase change makers and solutions that not just protect the environment but also grow the economy and reduce our social inequities. We put a spotlight on change makers that achieve ecological and sustainable goals at the same time while delivering economic progress that is inclusive and widely shared. And we think that that is the type of future that we want for our collective world. So, thank you for joining us for the first session. And I'm Pratima Manohar, and I'm so thrilled to co host this session with my colleague Nidhi Batra, who's in Delhi. Nidhi?
Hi everyone. I'm Nidhi Batra. I am founder of this organization called Sehreeti, and Prathama and I have been chewing this idea of really working towards, or thinking about what is the better way of development. And green growth is, of course, something that is very important to all of us. And we're so happy that we're opening our first session with Arshiya Bose, who's also in Bangalore right now, and she's an owner and a founder of a company called Baza Coffee. And the interesting part about Arshiya is that she believes and interested in community-led enterprises for biodiversity conservation. And through her journey of Black Baza Coffee, which actually believes is a similar such conservation enterprise, which looks at the welfare of the coffee growers and also about protecting the biodiversity, we're going to understand what really green growth means for her and how it has been beneficial not just for the biodiversity but also for the coffee farmers. Arshiya, of course, is also an Acumen Fellow. She has been National Geographical Explorer. She's been Kinship Conservation Fellow, and she's completed her PhD from University of Cambridge. And she's also done postdoctoral fellowship from Zurich. And so happy to have you, Arshiya, today. And would be great to say hi to you. And just to begin, I think the first question, or really to getting to know you, would be what we want to address. So if you could just briefly talk about yourself, how your journey has been. Did you ever think of becoming an entrepreneur, while you were doing your PhD? And from what we have read, you've also done PhD in the political ecology of the coffee farmers. So just, a quick introduction to you and what got you started in this would be very nice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And for having me sort of start off what I think should be a really insightful set of conversations about the idea of what green growth might be. As you clearly pointed out, I'm actually an academic. I was trained as a social scientist, and most of my work has been on how we might understand the relationship that people share with nature, that people have with nature, and what that understanding might do either for conservation of landscapes and biodiversity, but also for the long-term survivability of such relationships, because we know, of course, that the relationships we share with nature have changed and transitioned so much over the past 100 years. And much of the work that I was doing actually in my previous role was looking at both advocacy as well as research in this space. That said, the idea of growth and economy and market have been strained words to kind of figure out my own association with. I definitely come from the kind of academic background that critiqued markets, that critiqued the growth of economy, and business and entrepreneurship and really green growth was really seen to be extractive and exploitative, right? So it's kind of funny that I found myself running a company, running a business, and um, amongst the many things that are difficult and challenging about the business, and we can talk about that later. One of the biggest challenges has, of course, also getting the mind right about the fact that all business may not necessarily be extractive and exploitative, and what then might the other shapes and forms that businesses can take. So that's kind of a little bit about the sort of ideological background that I approach Black Baza Coffee with. But really, the kind of journey into coffee. So there are a couple of things that are sort of accidental to where I am now. One, of course, is that I'm running a business, which I never thought I'd do. I always thought I would do either kind of policy advocacy or continue to do research. But I suppose I don't know whether I'm a poor academic in the sense that it's very difficult for me to be dispassionate and detached from the work I'm doing and from the observations I'm making. I can't help but be deeply moved, and then I suppose moved enough to actually want to look at how change might happen. So it's in that respect that I transitioned from an academic career into a much more sort of hands-on career. We do continue to do some research at Black Baza Coffee, but it is always action research. So it is research in the sense that might actually lead to concrete outcomes that either the community we work with want or hope for. So in that sense, it's been a huge transition away from an academic world. The other accidental thing, of course, for me is coffee. I must admit that, before we started out this journey, I liked coffee, but I wasn't obsessed with it. And the past, since 2010, really, so past 9 years, has been an obsession with coffee, which I never really thought, so that's my last mug of the day. Which I never really thought I would end up in. So it's, a lot of, I suppose, jigsaw puzzles kind of fit together to have us end up where we are. And part of the beauty is that because it was something that I think I didn't plan, it was always about, I suppose, navigating to find what might be most relevant to, if the simple kind of answer or the question is, how might I be most useful or how might I be most impactful? And then let the everything around me kind of mold or push me in that direction. And then let's see where we end up. That's kind of been the approach, which has been fun. Yes.
And Arshiya, you've built a coffee brand that has a lot of following and fans, and the tagline is it's the most sustainable coffee brand in India. Tell us a bit about Black Baza Coffee, and also, given that you actually started the vision for this much earlier, tell us a little bit about the overall aim of the venture. What was the kind of challenge, the green economy challenge you were trying to tackle with this social venture?
So, coffee is globally one of the most highly valued commodities, second only to oil, I think. And across the world, in many countries, people consume almost as much coffee as they do water. I think 1/3 to water is what the sort of consumption of coffee in some of the most highest consuming countries is. And so not only has coffee shaped global markets, but it's also significantly shaped ecosystems. And we've seen coffee plantations shape ecosystems across the world, whether it is from the Central and South Americas, which are, of course, the largest producing coffee growing nations in the world, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Southeast Asia, and in the Indian Western Ghats as well. Increasingly now in the Brahmaputra Valley and parts of Northeast India as well. So we've really seen coffee shape both local economics, but local ecosystems, as I said, which makes it a very interesting point of focus. Because, as much as we love the beverage and as much as we know that, the world probably will not run if we don't drink coffee, we also know that it has a significantly dark history. And historically, even in India, and coffee in India is about, from the 1800s, but historically, plantations have cleared vast tracts of forest in some of the most biodiversity rich areas across the world, and also severely exploited people across this value chain. So the structural kind of inequalities that exist in the coffee space are quite enormous. And for us at Black Baza Coffee, I suppose the vision was to really reimagine whether it was possible to grow and sell coffee in a completely different marketplace. And so what we kind of try to do is change what that architecture of that marketplace would look like, but also fundamentally question what we value when we drink a cup of coffee. Do we value only the flavor of what it tastes like? Do we also value the process, people, and the land and the ecosystem that goes into producing this cup of coffee? And if we had to actually create a coffee that actually was much more embedded in that local landscape, what would it be like? What would that sort of coffee taste like? What would it feel like? What would it do to the kind of people and ecosystems we were working with? Could coffee be a means for a much more inclusive and equal value chain, is the question that we sort of started off with. And in that sense, that's kind of been our vision. We say that our vision is to really look at how we might empower coffee growers to protect biodiversity on their farms. And we've sort of specifically also turned and focused our days on working with smallholder coffee producers, because one of the things we might not know and realize about coffee is that coffee is entirely grown by smallholder growers. And by entirely, I don't mean entirely, but 70% of coffee producers across the world and India are actually cultivating coffee on very, very small bits of land. So in India, it's 10 acres or less. So small and marginal farmers growing coffee face a completely different set of challenges than we might expect, right? And in that respect, coffee is not very different from people who are cultivating rice, people who are cultivating millets, and finding and struggling to find access to fair and transparent markets. So yeah, I mean, at its heart, I think we don't approach conserving nature and livelihood security as two separate things necessarily. Our approach really has been to see whether a biodiversity friendly cup of coffee can also really be a strong source of livelihood for smallholder producers across the country.
So Arshiya, I have to say that I was introduced to your coffee by a friend who brings up your coffee every time we go for a morning walk, and he's very diligent to pack it. Yeah. And then we got to know about Black Baza and the whole entire approach, the environment friendly approach that you do. So it'll be great actually to you do have a few slides for us and run through those for us. I think it'll be good to understand the process and your stakeholders and the
Sure.
entire
I'm
enterprise.
happy to do that. Shall I go ahead right away?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think
Sure.
this was, all of us consume coffee or tea on a daily basis. And
Yeah.
it's amazing that we don't think about the
Yeah.
ecological story or the livelihood
Right.
story behind that
Yeah.
cup of coffee.
Right.
And
And I mean, you raise such an important point. So for us, it always feels like if we can do it for coffee, then it feels like we might be able to do it for rice. We might be able to do it for millets. We might be able to do it for many of the other things that we're growing and consuming as staples, right? Coffee is still a luxury good in India, and so maybe there's a kind of price point there that we can kind of work with really to explore whether it's possible to actually shift to something much more sustainable. Um, Let me kind of share with you very quickly um, the story a little bit about what we've done. Actually, I have already shared of this with you already while we were just talking, but I can do that very quickly. Um, you can see my screen, right?
yes,
Perfect.
Yes.
So the company I run is called Black Baza Coffee, and Black Baza is a small bird of prey that's found across South Asia and Southeast Asia. Um, and we just found the bird and its behavior fascinating, and we thought it might sort of symbolically represent what we were setting out to do. Also in the sense that you'll see a number of wildlife motifs and symbolism throughout much of our branding, and a lot of it really also has to do with what do wildlife on coffee farms tell us. Could they indicate that the ecosystem is healthy and so on. So we also select some of the species we do see in these areas to sort of be ambassadors for our coffee when once it reaches people across
can you
India
tell
who
us a
think.
bit about the species that you see in a coffee plantation, just to kind of
Yes,
make
shall
it?
I will. I mean, once
Oh, wow.
I'll show you some, but
Yeah.
just wanted to kind of, as I said, that most so coffee has a human cost to it. Most are small growers, and particularly in India, actually, a lot of indigenous communities living in and around forest areas have, over the past, I would say, 20 or 30 years, looked at transitioning from foraging, hunting, gathering, collecting non-timber forest produce to coffee, to cultivating coffee. And we see that sort of pattern across many coffee growing parts of the country. But coffee also has biodiversity costs. So we don't know, but actually there are hundreds and hundreds of species of coffee plants. Um, we're only used to drinking three, but what you can see, this huge bean called the ambongo is almost extinct. The coffee plant itself is almost extinct, and what we're drinking, in comparison, the arabica bean, which is lauded and by coffee drinkers across the world, is so much smaller. So the point being that we haven't even fully discovered coffee yet, right? As a plant, we haven't discovered the flavors that we might really be missing out on. And there's a lot of fear actually that around climate change, that coffee might go extinct in about 50 years or so, because it requires a mix of sort of humid and sort of colder climate, and at least in some parts of India, we feel that in many other parts of the world, coffee is grown at an altitude. Um, That's much higher than actually some of the southern hills in India. And the biggest worry is that, there's not too much further up in elevation that we might be able to go across in India. And so, what happens then when climate changes enough that we have to sort of start exploring other parts to grow coffee. Um, the biggest kind of environmental driver of what we see as biodiversity loss is probably the fact that in order to cultivate coffee in many parts of the world, what has happened is that vast tracts of forest have been cleared to cultivate coffee. Um, and that kind of unshaded monoculture of just growing coffee, of course, impacts a range of species because you don't really see birds, you don't see arboreal animals, you don't see insects, you don't see a lot of the wildlife that you would had there also been native vegetation. And so, what we're trying to do, I suppose, which is really nicely kind of illustrated by this figure, is to look at whether we can grow much more rustic coffee compared to that unshaded monoculture. So coffee alongside a lot of shade trees, so trees and forest trees that provide shade for coffee. Um,
And is this like world over that it has moved to this unshaded way of a monoculture, or
um,
was it in practice to do it as a rustic farming or a co-farming kind of
It is,
arrangement?
I mean, it's a trend that moved in other parts of the world much faster than it did in India. So in India, we're still in that transition from shade to sun grown farming,
Okay.
which is partly why we feel there's actually an opportunity to kind of look at changing that trend before it's too late, in a sense, right? Because it takes a very long time to grow back forest
Yeah.
once we've lost it. Whereas in other parts of the world, so the biggest reason that this kind of sun grown farming exists is that the yield and productivity of coffee is very high when you grow it under the sun. And so in areas of the world that receive regular rainfall, that have, a lot of pressure to produce a lot of coffee, like in Brazil, which is where this picture with the neat rows of coffee is from, that transition to sun-grown farming happened a fair a bit earlier. Whereas in India, we have stricter environmental regulations. Trees still play somewhat of a role in the landscape. So that transition has been slower here, but it's certainly happening. And there's a lot of kind of aerial and remote sensing data that will tell you that 33% of coffee from some of the largest producing districts in India have been lost in the past 30 years because of exactly this transition.
Right. And they also take a lot of water, right? As in coffee plantations.
Um, they
Not as
do,
much as tea, but yeah.
yeah, they do. And in some parts of India where coffee is irrigated, it is certainly an issue. But actually, coffee can be rain fed to some extent. The issue of kind of the sort of irrigation and rain and water is an interesting one, because when you look at, coffee that's been grown in a rustic way, you can imagine that even if we have long periods of drought and really hot summers, the soil will have some moisture because of all this shade cover on top. Whereas in unshaded monoculture situations, you would have to irrigate because
Yeah.
the soil would dry out really quickly. So it's, I mean, yeah, I mean, the issue of water and productivity and are things that people are balancing all the time. But as I said, I mean, coffee is a very old industry, which means that sort of dismantling what power structures exist have been hugely challenging. And for us, not only because, I mean, whenever we think of nature conservation as an objective or as an outcome, there are at least 100 other vested interests that look at extraction from nature as an outcome, right? And so that's certainly one huge challenge in terms of sort of dismantling what those vested interests are. And the same when we look at what smallholder producers can do. Most markets and most value chains have been structured in a way that actually exploitation of smallholder farmers at one end really serves the interest of everybody else along that value chain. And so dismantling that fundamental power structure requires actually shifting something that's quite fundamental and quite challenging. And I mean, as we kind of talk about what the challenges are, we'll understand more and more how something as seemingly mundane as a coffee business can actually be doing far more in the background that's hidden. One of the key kind of ways that the environmental space has responded to allegations of biodiversity loss and deforestation, so on and so forth, has been to create certifications as mechanisms that address this, right? So a certification is a very simple label that's provided on a bag of coffee or on a bag of tea or chocolate or whatever you have it, that is meant to indicate very quickly to the consumer that this product has been grown in a particular way. And there are a number of certifications. Some address social concerns, some address environmental concerns. So the organic certification addresses whether chemical, pesticides, or inputs have been used on a product. That's the one that we might be most familiar with. But there are others. There's the fair trade certification that looks at whether producers and actually indeed everybody along that value chain has been treated fairly. And the big environmental certifications include the Rainforest Alliance certification, which is an environmental certification that looks at broadly classifying products that have been grown in compliance with what Rainforest Alliance and other certifications believe is good for the environment and so on. So that's kind of broadly how that certification space works. And we've globally kind of really, it's probably the most widespread form of monitoring or measuring sustainability in the plantation space. When we kind of approached doing things, we started from the question of really asking who monitors and for what purpose. Because with many of these certification structures, what we found is that many of the producers still didn't fully understand, engage, benefit, take use of being a part of that process, right? And many of these certification standards were actually designed very far away from where they were being implemented. And we felt there was actually a space for a much more local and relevant dialogue about how producers really wanted to grow coffee, what space and what was the opportunity to conserve biodiversity in the way they felt, because we felt, actually people living in that landscapes are the best custodians of what biodiversity exists and also have the most knowledge of how to go about conserving it. And our approach really has been, so can producers take much more of a leadership role in also that sustainability element. And it means that...
Was that a priority for them? Was that a priority for them?
Was that a
priority? Were they thinking about it, about the conservation, about the biodiversity? Was that something which was significant to them?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. And my experience is that the sort of response to that is different in different ways, depending on kind of where you are and what you're looking at, which sounds like a kind of escapist answer, but it's actually not. So, for example, what I mean by biodiversity conservation may be completely different from what a producer perceives this as, right? So, typically, when conservationists have looked at conserving biodiversity in landscapes, they've looked at large megafauna, whether it's tigers or elephants or some very charismatic species. And many producers are actually looking at ants, they're looking at termites, they're looking at lichen, they're looking at earthworms, they're looking at bees. And conserving some of these species is valuable not only for the forest in the way that they would talk about it, but also because it helps coffee and it's very much a part of the cultural fabric of the place. We found actually, even in sort of modern ecological studies, have found that some smaller taxa are actually far better indicators than some of the larger ones, right? So while we've been focusing on really large animals moving in and around, the tigers and the polar bears and the pandas, actually the ants and lichen and earthworms and beetles are telling us perhaps a far more realistic picture of what's happening in an ecosystem. So I think the question of sort of, whether it's a priority or not really depends on how we are asking that question. So bees are certainly a priority. Bees are a conservation priority. Globally, now we recognize it. But producers have known that bees, farmers of all sorts of crops have known that bees are important for many, many decades, right? Because bees are pollinating some of their crops. Coffee is very, very heavily pollinated by bees. There are many studies that show it as well. And so coffee producers don't need to be convinced about conserving bees in the same way that we might be convinced about conserving bees sitting in Bangalore or Delhi. Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question. And I think something that deserves a lot more research as well, and a lot more dialogue, I think, with stakeholders in these areas to really understand what conservation means and what species they want to conserve and for what purpose.
Arshiya, if we were to, this is such a fascinating vision, I must say, conserving, biodiversity, which means that
I'm getting many gray hairs in the process, but I'll hold on to the word fascinating every time I'm feeling low.
No, I think we'll also make sure that we consume more of your coffee. And I'm sure it's much more healthier for all of us, considering all the bees and the other species.
And no pesticides. I think that's another thing, right? We talk about no pesticides and a shaded approach.
So some of the, there are many different ways that the coffee is farmed very differently. And you can kind of see in this, so I'll explain this image to you in a bit, but very simply, there's no chemical pesticide or fertilizer that goes into the coffee. And of course, coffee is grown then alongside a lot of native tree species, forest trees, really. And so the very, very common sense sort of approach that if you bring back trees and you bring back vegetation, biodiversity will come back. And in this,
this is, I just want to again say it's so inspiring to not just conserve biodiversity, but kind of protect livelihoods in that way, and also ensure that the coffee that we drink is more healthy for us, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not until very long ago that endosulfan was sprayed on coffee. Since endosulfan has been prohibited.
It's a chemical pesticide, right?
Endosulfan, yeah, I mean, it's what gives, there's like horrific health effects and things of consuming endosulfan. And I mean, a few years ago, there was a bunch of news reports that really broke out on spraying of endosulfan in Kasargod and other parts of Kerala, and many, many generations of health effects. So it's not very long ago that endosulfan was sprayed on coffee, and now the substitute chloropyrifos is really not very different. And so, I mean, do you really want to start the day with that? Is that what we want to ingest? Is a question we should ask ourselves as well.
I think there's so much more consciousness on that topic of how food affects health at this point in time. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking at the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the economy, if you look at the economic numbers, we are in turmoil. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the areas that continues to grow is the organic food areas.
Right.
So entrepreneurs are working in that space seem to see more. Consumers kind of becoming loyal to their brands, and once people understand the health implications of foods that are being produced commercially with
Mm-hmm.
pesticides, maybe they'll be moved towards such organic
So,
healthy brands.
yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And one of, given the situation that we're in now, there's very, very powerful and compelling theories of how big farms cause big flu.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that intensified agriculture that has not only pumped loads and loads of chemicals into the soil, stripped the soil and land of its natural resilience, and then also really pushed the boundaries between um, what spaces are forest and what spaces are intensive farming, including livestock, really, have led to a host of both kind of diseases that affect us as humans, but diseases that affect our livestock, that affect our plants, that affect our crops, and so on and so forth. So I mean, I'm a completely huge believer in the idea that there's a really big and important space to really step back now and look at whether business as usual really ought to be the business as usual, right? And what might be the opportunity at this time to really think very differently about how we grow our food,
Right.
how we sell our food, and then also who grows our food.
I think there's already links being drawn between biodiversity loss and the pandemic, and
Mm-hmm,
I was and this was on CNN, like the most
mm-hmm.
populous news media that you can see,
Yeah,
where this is mainstream news where they were saying that we are entering the era of pandemics and it's linked to biodiversity loss. So
yeah.
as we exit this situation of
Mm-hmm.
the COVID-19 health crisis, hopefully we move more towards ideals of green growth. And I think I see that there will be more resurgence towards those types of economic activities. And
Yeah,
I think there's a need to push for policy to incentivize the right way of doing things. And
absolutely.
maybe tax the wrong way of doing things. I think now
Yeah.
very we've seen the specifics of what it means. Um, with this pandemic, the amount of economic loss that we are going to have to deal with at the end of the tunnel is going to be bigger than anything that we've seen in modern history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would say it's because we've ignored what all the scientists told about
Mm-hmm.
climate change. So,
And I would
and
add to that, people at the grassroots. So it's not just, the voices of scientists that we see every day, but, people at the grassroots, people living in the forest, people living alongside biodiversity, people cultivating the land in a very different way have been saying things for decades. And one of the very interesting conversations we had with some of our producers when the pandemic started was why do you think there is this pandemic? And many of our, of course, literacy levels are not very high, and people have been to school in the local tribal hamlet, and they don't have access to the independent news reports and so on that we have, let alone sort of scientific quote unquote studies. But almost every coffee producer and person that we spoke to in the landscape very clearly said that it is because forests are being lost across the world that we end up in situations where we have these kinds of big diseases. And they actually referred back to a disease that had spread called fire fever. The English translation would be fire fever. 300 years ago, that really influenced them. And I don't think, I think we're very surprised that we are in a pandemic, but I think a lot of people who live very close to the land and live very close to the forest are not surprised that there is a pandemic, and are
Yeah,
not surprised that climate is changing.
So
yeah.
true.
And I mean, since there's pictures of toads and mushrooms, I will just say some of
Yes.
the um, quickest indicators that climate is changing are things like mushrooms and
Yeah.
toads. Because if there's no rain, you will not see mushrooms and toads. And if there is chemicals in the water, in the waterways, or in the soil, you will not see toads and mushrooms. So they're amazing to kind of, we don't always need a lab that tells us things about what's around us, and sometimes just keen observations in the way that people have been making is so much more rich.
So if you went into a coffee plantation and you saw this, some of this, then it would indicate that the coffee would be amazing for you and healthy, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, so I refuse to put the pictures of big animals. So there's only elephant poop for it to show you, but I'm not going to
Yeah.
show you an elephant because really the small critters tell us such a rich kind of picture. And so what we will do is that in addition to taking the coffee back and looking at whether there are heavy metals in a lab and pesticide residues and so on and so forth, producers will also look around their farm and see whether there is the same kind of lichen. Is it coming at the same time? Are there earthworms in the soil? Are there different earthworms? Is the size of the earthworm different? Are the earthworms behaving differently? Are they coming out at different seasons? um, you know um, there's so many questions to be asked if we look at farms as labs and forests as labs where we can learn from just by observing. So yes, I mean that's exactly right. So a lot of the coffees we have, and I can probably show you that's it, that's the next one. A lot of the coffees we have actually do tell us that the coffee farm is wildlife friendly or biodiversity friendly, right? We've actually moved from we have an interesting way of kind of approaching it as well. When we started, we said we were 100% biodiversity friendly, and then we realized that seemed too definite and too absolute. So then we became biodiversity friendly, and now we think we're actually diversity friendly because it's beyond just the sort of biological diversity that's in a place. And next year we might just be friendly coffee. So it's a process. But if you look at the different coffees we have, many of them are amazing ecological indicators. So Luna moths, Lepidoptera or moths and butterflies are just known to be amazing indicators of what's going on in an ecosystem. You don't typically find certain species of moths and butterflies in areas that have too much pesticide use or don't have native vegetation. So if you had a sun-grown coffee farm, for example, you wouldn't really find many of these species. Ants, again, are amazing indicators. So it's not only just kind of, we have a jumping ant coffee, and it's not just necessarily the species of ants, but then again, sort of what their body size is, and what the composition of an ant's nest is. And so you can really go very, very fine scale into understanding what biodiversity on a farm is, which makes it so exciting because I feel like I've created for myself this dream job, right? That will sustain me for the next 50 years. And I don't ever have to look anywhere else. So it feels very, very exciting.
That's brilliant. Actually, another question. When you were showing that image where there were people and monitoring something on the
Mm-hmm.
forest or looking up at the tree.
Mm-hmm.
So just so what is the role of the community, and how do they help you? I mean, they understand these aspects, like you said, that they understand where
Mm-hmm.
lichen is more important or where bees are more
Mm-hmm.
important in the monitoring landscape for you. And there's an
Right.
interesting concept of conservation agreement that you've signed with these
Mm-hmm.
producer companies,
Mm-hmm.
no? So would love to know how the farmers themselves play a role in the conservation. What do
Mm-hmm.
they teach you about their area, and what is the kind of relationship that you have with them in this?
Right. So, I mean, we talked about certifications, and for us, the starting point was to look at if we could create a much more bottom up, producer friendly approach to what conservation is. And we've actually transitioned from something like a conservation agreement to a fair degree as well. But what typically happens when we begin to work in a place is is the first sort of space to kind of explore further is whether there is an existing farmer producer organization or a cooperative, or whether there are individuals in a landscape. And it varies a lot. There's not a big history of cooperatives for coffee in India, and we found that actually a fair amount of work, our work, really goes into exploring whether creating a collective might be beneficial for the producers in that particular region. So that's the kind of first approach. And the second sort of approach is to understand better what that ecosystem is. So we might, with producers, do baseline surveys of farms to understand what exists, what kind of tree species exist, what kind of biodiversity exists. And then we move on to something really interesting. So we developed through a project that we're doing with the National Geographic Society, a process of playing games, board games, and role playing games to understand and see if we could arrive at a farming practice. So, can a hamlet of 22 people, through playing a game where we simulate a scenario, and that scenario could be, the hamlet decides as a rule that there will be, everyone will have to keep 25 species of trees on their farm in addition to coffee, right? I'm just giving you an example. How willing is everyone there to do that? And what happens if I, as a producer, decide I'm not going to follow 1 year and cut all my shade trees down, and then what does that do with the relationship I have with the rest of the hamlet? So it's through this game that we kind of arrive at not only what that farming standard is, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, but also what the rules and terms and conditions are as a producer. So what would be the sanctions or the fees or the penalties or the incentives for me to comply or not comply with the rest of my hamlet? Um, and because that process is so kind of co-created in a sense, we then move on to kind of everybody getting on board and actually growing coffee in that particular way. And we're in that stage now. So we're in the process of everybody kind of really figuring out um, what will happen if people don't comply or comply. But it's been a very interesting process of really starting from that's why, in a sense, it's so community led, because community themselves decide what farming practices they feel will best conserve biodiversity, as opposed to me kind of coming in and saying that. And then, of course, the monitoring is done by producers themselves, right? I mean, very clear that we didn't want to police or inspect or investigate or do surveillance. I mean, these were like outrageous ideas that we didn't want to go into. And our approach and philosophy has always been that if producers feel accountable to a particular kind of farming process, it's much more likely that it will be true. And there's a lot of interesting data that's shown that actually many people really do what they say they will do. I mean, this idea that as consumers we need to police them and find out really is it true that people are doing certain things, I'm not sure holds true on the ground.
Makes sense.
Actually,
That's great.
I want to talk a little bit about the unit economics here. Does this cost more money to do it this way?
For sure. I mean, there's two things that right. The first is it takes the first is to really understand what happens to the amount of coffee you get from a farm if you grow coffee alongside native vegetation. There's a number of kind of anecdotal stories that will say that the yield of coffee and the production of coffee really drops if you grow it with native forest trees. But then there's a lot of anecdotal stories that say that actually that change isn't as much as we're so afraid of, right? So there's a lot more kind of research to be done into the kind of cost benefits from a production perspective, to understand, what that loss in productivity is when you grow it alongside native vegetation. But for us as a company, I mean, there's so much of resources and time that's actually in what would be the domain of either a state or a conservation NGO or a development NGO or a coffee farming NGO. I mean, in a way, we play all of these roles. And that means that in some sense, what might be CSR activity at best for a coffee company, for us really is the core of what we do. So of course that's kind of built into the supply chain, right? So the fact that coffee has to be grown in a particular way, producers need to be involved in all of that stuff is very much a part of the supply chain of what we're trying to do. We're trying to, in some sense, change that industry best practice to say that how you treat the ecosystem and how you treat producers should be a part of your supply chain. It should not be something that's seen in addition to.
And are consumers willing to pay a little additional for a coffee that?
I mean, it's a very complicated question in a sense, right? Because there's a couple of things that go into that. One is that as consumers, we're just not used to paying for the full cost of what we drink. The market doesn't account at all for environmental externalities, and we're just not used to paying the price for it. So there's one kind of huge dialogue to be had with consumers about, is the price of your coffee really 500 rupees a kilo that you're paying? Is it really that? What are the hidden costs? Who's losing out as a result of you having to pay 500 rupees a kilo? You know what I mean? So there's a much more, I think, fundamental conversation to be had there. The second question is, whether there's in some sense a premium for coffee that's been grown in this particular way, and my answer to that is really depends on what time of the day you ask me the question. Very honestly, sometimes I feel we do all of this for ourselves. And there isn't necessarily a clear-cut market for something that's as kind of thorough as the process we're trying to create. That's for sure.
I have to say that I think this is such a big economy question, right? Like, I think we need policies to support these types of businesses. And I
Yeah.
remember, I think a couple of years ago, a lot of the central banks of Europe started speaking about looking at every company from a climate resilience and a climate risk perspective. And as we go forward, you'll see much more of that. And um, a lot of the big coffee producers and the current ecosystem may have to kind of start adopting um, these practices, and your social venture could become innovative product at that point in time which they can use. And but is your business model in different in any way to deliver this product, or does it work like any other coffee business?
Um, no, so I mean, even within, so even within coffee as a product, there's a pretty big range that kind of would go from off the supermarket shelf coffee to what we'd call specialty coffee which would be a little bit different, which would be the category that we would fall under. And that means couple of different things. It means that, there are symbolic properties to that product. And then there are physical properties to that product. The symbolic properties for us are, of course, that it's biodiversity friendly, it's grown in a way that really truly respects producers and the land and the ecosystem and so on and so forth, and that it's completely transparent, right through the consumer in terms of where it's coming from, what's going on, and so forth. Physical characteristics of that coffee are also significantly different when you look at specialty coffee, and that's a space where we've had to do a lot of research and development and investment into developing coffee in itself, which means that it's only, there's a lot of, only the best coffee beans are picked. There's a lot of, for us, because we're looking at smallholder producers, it also means a fair amount of training and capacity building has to go into training people on how to grow specialty coffee, because even for producers, that's a completely new thing, right? So most people would just sell off coffee in the regular market, but that conventional market certainly won't pay the premium for the kind of process we're talking about. So it has to be a specialty coffee product, and that means that at our end as roasters, we've had to really look at how that coffee is roasted, how it's delivered across to people, what kind of customizations and blends and so on can we do that really enhance the experience to the end customer. And then it's also meant really, as I said, kind of gearing the capability and capacity of producers to be able to grow coffee in that way. Because, the market is, in some sense, many consumers are fairly agnostic about all of the symbolic properties, right? So we have people come for different reasons, and those people who are primarily coffee drinkers and are less sort of maybe committed to that the symbolic process, are not necessarily looking and understanding that it's smallholder producers who are living on the edge of the forest, who are extremely marginalized and vulnerable, and there's no concessions for that, right? So it's a kind of fine balance of really looking at both things, and in some sense, I think that I don't think is going to change very soon. I think even social enterprises or socially kind of we're a while away, I think, from the space that maybe handloom enjoys in a way, and it's been an I think of handloom often because there are parts of that handloom and handmade process where defects are not seen as defects, they're seen as uniqueness. And that's a space that food is in at the moment. So a small producer, old lady growing and drying coffee on the ground that has a little bit more moisture is not being lauded for her unique flavor. She's being penalized by the farm gate trader for having too much moisture in the coffee. So we're a while away from that, I think. I don't know what gets us there.
What about I mean, there's a lot which has happened in awareness. Let's say in handlooms. I mean, there's been that story on since very long, and like you rightly said, that coffee is something which is entering now. So aspects of awareness for the consumer at end. Like you said, not everybody is interested in the symbolic process, but there are many activities that you engage with, right?
Yeah.
To inform the consumers about the entire process. So, I mean, would you tell us a bit about that, and where do you think it should go from there? Because I think that can be a good changer, the education of the consumer by itself.
Um, yes, for sure. I mean, we do a lot to kind of communicate and tell that story to consumers. We send them postcards, and in fact, our coffee bag is filled with information about sort of what that process is. We will hide information in really unique places. So, I
Yeah.
mean, kind of becomes a sort of content experience as well. We started something very interesting called Coffee Grounds, which was meant to be a much more long form literary version of what small bits and pieces you might find on Instagram or social media, because we felt, okay, I mean, if the whole process is about telling that longer, richer, slower story, then we'd have to write long form. And so we started this publication called Coffee Grounds, which looks at telling unique everyday stories from coffee landscapes. And it's been interesting. I mean, those I think those consumers who have the interest and the patience to engage have really enjoyed it. And for everyone else, I think it's kind of nudging it, right? So I think I'm only getting a bag of coffee, but God, there's all the other information that in some sense I'm compelled to engage with. And as conservationists, we do that all the time. We try to make conservation, or we want conservation to be everybody's agenda, right? And
Exactly.
we want social justice to be everybody's agenda, and in some sense that's always the challenge.
And do you do tours in your coffee plantation or the forest?
I mean, we have to do that soon. um,
Okay.
um, we have to do that soon. I mean, many of the places we work in just don't have the infrastructure to support that. But it's
Right.
something that I think we have to start looking at doing in a much more constructive way. Yeah.
Right.
But I
Right.
have to say that if I, had that coffee and I knew all the amazing species that were around that coffee, it just would increase my happiness quotient when I was drinking
Yeah.
that cup of coffee. So I love the
Yeah.
whole kind of consumer education campaign and I mean, I love the idea of the tour. I think we
Mm,
have to make some of this experiential to really
exactly.
connect with the larger community. One of my last question to you is around metrics, and I know you mentioned it. How do you
Mm.
measure your impact and metrics as a social venture? Are there anything specific? Um, can you share
Yeah.
how you measure that?
I mean, we have, I mean, we're still, I would say, I think the challenge of sort of all um, social enterprises and so on is that actually measuring and monitoring and evaluating impact is quite challenging and tricky, and I mean, I think for us as well, it's a huge area of improvement. What we have done though, and we do though from time to time, I mean, we do a few things. One of them is to look at, we've done socioeconomic surveys. And now, because we work with 650 producers, many don't know me directly, of course. And so when we've done surveys, they haven't necessarily associated, the fact that they need to say something nice just because it's me, or they hurt my feelings or something like that. So we've done socioeconomic and income-based surveys that tell us that few different things are changing, right? So we know that, when we started working, the difference in price was almost 56% between what people were sort of ending up with as a result of partnering with us, and the other local traders. But in some sense, the beauty, I think, of what we do is that so much of it is driven by producers themselves, that if we were to do something that was not having an impact, I think we'd immediately know, because a lot of the decisions about sort of how coffee should be priced, and how many producers we should get coffee from, or who should come to meetings, whose voice should be heard. So much of this is actually just determined. Actually, I'm not so much. I mean, I hardly make decisions about some of these things that happen, right? The more interesting things that we're now getting into measuring are around ecological metrics, and it feels like a good time now, because we're now sort of 3 years down, because it takes a while. I mean, it takes a while to start seeing ecological change. So we've been able to measure things like changes in canopy cover. So we know that, um, not cutting tree canopies will, of course, you'll be able to see that change in 2-3 years, because canopies will spread out and so on and so forth. But on other metrics in terms of biodiversity, like are there now different species from birds than there were 3-4 years ago? That's a bit tricky, and we haven't been able to really get into that. What we've done, interestingly, though, is compare some of our producer partners with farms elsewhere. So, for example, we know that when we look at spiders, there's a clear difference in the kind of foliage spiders that you see on, and so foliage spiders refer to spiders on, in the native vegetation, not on the ground, um, compared to farms elsewhere, or conventional farms, and so on and so forth. So those kinds of things we know, but there's a lot. I mean, it's a hugely interesting area as well. Oh, we've also measured carbon. We had an amazing Fulbright scholar who came and spent some time with us to look at the comparison of how much carbon was being sequestered in the shade trees that all our producer partners had, as compared to other conventional farms. So we know how much more carbon is being sequestered on our coffee farms than elsewhere. So I mean, some things are easier to measure than others, which
I
is
think even those visual measurements were so fascinating, just to see all that wildlife come back
yeah,
into life. It was amazing.
yeah.
And I think I just want to say to everyone watching us, go to blackbazacoffee.com.
Ah,
I think I saw a talk of yours where they said forest in a cup of coffee. And I think this
that's true.
conversation has really kind of made that vision come alive. So I'm going to make sure I get some of that coffee, and I can't wait to come and hang out in that
Yes,
some of
absolutely.
those plantations and see all the wildlife. And I also want to say that I think it's so amazing that you were able to increase their earnings
Hmm.
by 56%, right? Like
Hmm.
that's, or even if it
It's
was
huge.
10%. And I
Hmm.
think that's what green growth means to
Hmm.
me, where you're enabling the bottom of the pyramid to rise, and
Hmm.
bringing nature back. So yeah, it's very, very inspiring, and I hope these kind of ideas grow and thrive.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arshiya, for joining us. And I think it's quite a learning experience, and the fact that entrepreneurship was not something that came instantly to you, and how you've grown from studying it and researching it,
Mm.
and then actually deep diving into it. I think that's a very, very interesting journey. And I think it's a great learning for all of us. I mean, all of us who want to make an impact, that there is a possibility, and that's what we try to do from these green growth series. And thank you so much. I mean, I think this was brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Good luck.
Yes,
Well,
and
I mean, we shall pull through all of us somehow.
yes. I also want to thank our amazing audience who joined us throughout this conversation. Thank you. Have a great evening. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.